A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Naki. A new episode every single day. Episode 25, Summons of Thessaly and Macedon. Outside the palace walls, the courtyard was a graveyard of silence until the riders shrieked tore it open. Pausanias. At the edge of the square, where the shadow of the gatehouse met the light of the torches, Ismenias stiffened. Behind him, the Theban vanguard, the custodians, shifted as one. They were not Macedonian. They did not care for the squabbles of regents or the lineage of Argead pretenders. They were soldiers of the great city, men trained in the rigid, unyielding geometry of the phalanx. As the name Pausanias echoed off the stone, the air around the Thebans seemed to drop in temperature. Ismenias did not turn his head, but his hand rested firmly on the pommel of his xiphis. He watched the panicked scramble of the Macedonian palace guards with a look of profound, professional contempt. To his left, his second in command, a grizzled veteran whose face was a map of scars, spat into the dust. "Illyrians," the veteran muttered, his voice barely audible above the mounting hysteria of the court. "They fight like wolves in the brush. If the road is severed, the boy king is trapped in a box." Ismenias remained motionless, his eyes tracking the frantic movements of Ptolemy's men. He didn't look at the panic, he looked at the lack of formation. They are not soldiers, he thought, the discipline of Thebes ingrained into his every muscle. They are a riot wearing armor. "Commander?" the veteran prompted, his hand tightening on his spear shaft. "The gate is closing. If we stay inside this courtyard, we are not guards. We are meat." Ismenias' gaze flickered to the balcony where Eurydice and her children had disappeared. His duty was to the contract, to the custodianship of the royal house. But the contract had not accounted for a usurper rising from the mist with the high ground already secured. "Watch the palace doors," Ismenias commanded, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of noise. Pausanias is a name for a civil war, not a siege. The Macedonians are terrified of their own ghost. And if the ghosts come through that gate? Ismenias adjusted his bronze greaves, his expression turning into a mask of cold, tactical resolve. "Then we show the Illyrians why the world fears the Theban front. We do not break, and we do not run. We hold this courtyard until the queen decides if she is a ruler or a corpse." He looked toward the dark entrance of the palace, his soldiers forming a bristling bronze wall of shields around the perimeter. They were the only men in the city who were not sweating. They were the only ones who knew exactly how to die in a line, and as the war drums of Pausanias vibrated through the ground beneath their feet, the custodians began to lock their shields, turning the courtyard into a fortress of defiance. The heavy doors of the inner sanctum groaned shut, sealing out the rhythmic, hollow thud of the funeral drums that still echoed through Pella's streets. Eurydice stood in the center of the room, her black veil clinging to her face like a spider's web. She had spent the last hours walking behind the litter of her son, Alexander II, and her limbs felt cast in lead. Behind her, the remnants of her house gathered in the shadows. Perdiccas, the new king, stood near the hearth, his 17-year-old frame looking fragile against the cold stone. He stared into the dying embers, his mind reeling. "Am I to be buried alive in this palace?" he wondered, the crushing weight of the crown already bowing his shoulders. "Is this the throne, a room full of ghosts and an enemy at the gate?" Euryno clung to his sleeve, her fingers nervously pleating the fabric of her dark dress. She did not look at the fire or her brother. She watched the heavy, bolted door. The drums, she thought, her heartbeat syncing with the distant rhythm. They aren't playing for Alexander anymore. They're playing for us. Philip stood by the balcony, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He was not mourning. He was counting the seconds. "Ptolemy is shaking," the guards are whispering, "and the gates are a sieve," he thought, his hand tied on his hilt. "If Mother tries to bargain with the regency again, we are already dead." Eurydice untied the suffocating mourning cloth. As it fell, she looked at the faces of her children, the broken king, the frightened girl, and the wolf-eyed boy. Before she could draw a full breath, the silence was shattered. The heavy oak doors swung wide, and a young servant burst through, his chest heaving. He stumbled toward her, thrusting out a hand that gripped a scroll sealed with the distinct austere wax of Athens. "My queen," the boy gasped. A rider arrived while the procession was still at the gates. He demanded it be delivered into your hand the moment you returned. Philip moved first, his stride predatory as he intercepted the boy, snapping the parchment from his hand. Eurydice stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she reclaimed the scroll. The leather was still warm from the writer's pouch, smelling of horses and the salt spray of the Aegean. She broke the seal with a snap of her thumb, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Philip, wait!" Perdiccas commanded, his voice lacking the steel of a monarch. "That is for the regent's eyes, not yours." Philip ignored him, his eyes raking over the text. "It is a choice, brother," he said, his voice cold as winter frost. "The Athenian offers his steel, but he demands our harbor as the price. He is not coming to save the Argeads. He is coming to collect the inheritance." Iphicrates is a mercenary, not a messiah, Eurydice thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But if he is the only blade that can cut through Pausanias, I will give him the harbor. I will give him the sea. I will give him everything, so long as my children draw breath." She scanned the letter, her eyes tracing the jagged script. "Eurydice, I received your plea. I have read the history you and I have already written together, and I see the ink is still wet with the blood of your sons. You call for the shield again, as you did when the first shadow first fell upon your house. You seek the iron that I once promised to be, but let us speak plainly. The iron has aged, and the fire has grown too large for any one man to hold back. I am deploying. Not because I believe in the survival of your current house. The geometry of your court is broken beyond my tactical correction, but because I am shackled to the promises made to a dead king in a room that no longer exists. I'm coming to Pella, but know this, I am not coming to save a crown. I'm coming to witness the final act of the tragedy we began. Watch the boy, Philip. If the regency survives the night, he's the only one who understands that in Pella, you do not fear the fire, you become it. I will be there before the moon turns." Iphicrates. Eurydice's hand trembled. It was a miracle, a reprieve from the abyss. She did not weep. She had no tears left to spend on gods or ghosts. She smoothed the heavy midnight black fabric of her stola and stared into the dark with a newfound lethal focus. "Leave us," she whispered, her voice devoid of warmth, yet sharp enough to cut through the heavy air of the chamber. The servant fled, leaving them in the deepening shadows. "He is on the move," she said, a thin, ghost-like smile touching her lips. "He's coming." "And when he arrives?" Philip asked, his eyes locked on hers with piercing clarity. "Do we invite him to the table, or do we show him why no outsider has ever truly ruled Pella?" Eurydice looked at her son, at the cold, crystalline ambition reflecting in his gaze, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if she had birthed a savior or a storm. "When he arrives," she answered, her tone absolute, "we will be ready to ensure he is the last choice we ever have to make." The march was over, but the war for the soul of the throne had shifted. The Argead line was not buried yet, not while the Athenian ships were cutting the waves toward them. The arrival of the usurper Pausanias descended upon Pella like a suffocating shroud, turning the city's mourning into a fever of uncertainty. With the inner gates hammered shut and the palace sealed, an eerie, claustrophobic silence gripped the capital. Inside the council chamber, the air was thick with the cloying scent of stale wine and the metallic tang of panic. Ptolemy paced the map table, his fingers tracing the jagged lines of the northern passes with rhythmic intensity. The news from the gorge had stripped away his composure. He looked like a man trying to hold back a flood with his bare hands. "The army is scattered and the Thracians are wavering," Ptolemy muttered. "If I divert the household guard to the gorge, Pella becomes a hollow shell." "Then you are a fool," the elder Attalus growled from the shadows. He leaned heavily on his staff, his eyes fixed on the regent with a predator's intensity. "You have played at politics while the wolves were circling. You need steel, Ptolemy, not gilded city guards, but real steel. Send word to Iphicrates. The Athenian owes this house a debt. Call him." Ptolemy froze, his hand hovering over the map. Iphicrates? To bring his mercenaries into Pella? He would claim the city for himself before the first Illyrian was slain. He's the only one who can hold the line. Attalus snapped. "We are lost without him. Choose, Regent, a Greek master or an Illyrian pyre." The heavy oak doors creaked open, and the chamber fell into a suffocating silence. Eurydice stepped into the light, movements fluid and utterly composed. She did not look like a woman mourning. She looked like a sovereign issuing a sentence. Ptolemy spun around, his face flushing with defensive pride. "Majesty, we are currently discussing the safety of the..." I know what you are discussing, Eurydice interrupted, her voice cool and low. She crossed the room and stopped at the table. She did not glance at the regent's frantic tactical scribbles. She looked directly at him. You waste breath arguing over a ghost. I have already sent the messengers. Attalus blinked, his hard expression softening into genuine surprise. You? When? The moment the first report of the Illyrian movement reached my spies, she said. She reached into the folds of her stola and dropped a scroll with a broken wax seal onto the table. Iphicrates did not wait for your permission, Ptolemy. He saw the threat to his own interests, and he has moved. Ptolemy snatched the parchment. As he read, the color drained from his face. He's already moving. He'll be here before the moon turns. Then we have our reprieve, Eurydice said, her gaze sweeping the room. But until he arrives, this city will not fall. Every man, every guard, and every lord in this room will hold their position. If the usurper comes to the gates, we do not cower. We make him bleed for every inch of stone he seeks to take. She turned toward the window, looking out over the city as it stared blindly into the abyss. Iphicrates is coming to save us from the realm of Hades, she murmured, more to herself than the room. But do not mistake his arrival for salvation. He's merely the hand that will hold the door shut, while we finish this war ourselves. Ptolemy began to pace again, his fingers twitching as he calculated the political price of the Athenians' blade. Iphicrates is a miracle, yes. But what of our allies in Thebes? If we have both the Athenian speed and the Theban weight, we do not just survive, we dictate the terms. The Thebans? Attalus scoffed, his voice dripping with cynical exhaustion. I sent the envoys 3 days ago, Ptolemy. I knew this peace wouldn't last, but I was counting on a speed they simply don't possess. They are marching overland, throttled by their own heavy siege trains and the tangle of those mountain passes. They are a glacier. They won't arrive in time to blunt this first bloody wave. We are on our own until the moon turns. He leaned heavily on his staff, unaware that both the regent and the queen had moved independently of his efforts. Neither had bothered to tell the old man that they had each dispatched their own desperate missives to Pelopidas, not asking for the slow-moving army, but for a swift, tactical intervention. Parmenion, who had been listening from the periphery with clinical detachment, stepped into the light. You speak of reinforcements as if they are already at our gates, Attalus, but the army is still a ghost. The only living shield we possess is the vanguard in the courtyard. Ismenias already commanded his men to watch the palace doors. He knows what you refuse to see. The Greeks inside are busy arguing over ghosts, while the Illyrians are closing in. We are being held by the steel of Theban mercenaries, not by the promises of letters sent to generals who are still leagues away. Attalus looked at the empty chairs of the council, his eyes dim with the weight of impending slaughter. We are walking into the dark and no one is coming to light the way. Ptolemy remained silent, guarding his own secret dispatch to Pelopidas, while Eurydice, standing in the shadows of the doorway, kept her own counsel, letting the old man believe his failed diplomacy was the only reach they had made for the heavens. Then the Thebans are a ghost, Eurydice said, her voice cutting through the tension. We cannot anchor our survival to a marching phalanx still leagues away. Ptolemy looked at the Queen Mother, his composure fraying further. If the Thebans are too slow, and Iphicrates is only one man with a fleet, we are still effectively trapped. No, Eurydice corrected him, her eyes burning with terrifying, cold resolve. We are simply forced to be the anvil. The Thebans are the hammer, and Iphicrates is the blade. But an anvil does not move, Ptolemy. It endures. She looked toward the door where the rhythmic, distant thunder of war drums echoed against the palace walls. Hold the gates, she commanded. The Thebans will see our smoke from the horizon, and they will know what price they have paid for their hesitation. But for now, do not look to the road. Look to the wall. We hold until the ships reach the harbor, or we do not hold at all. Vanguard pavilion of the Theban army, Thessaly, morning after the funeral, the interior of the Theban camp, was steeped in the fragrance of damp red clay and the smoke of oak firewood. Within the heavy, oppressive stillness that governed the pre-dawn of late May, a thick, stagnant humidity lingered implacably, like a warm, sentient observer. Inside the dim pavilion, beside the wavering light cast by a solitary oil lamp, stood General Pelopidas, Beodarch of the Boeotian League, and the very heart of the wildfire that radiated from the Sacred Band, Hieros Laches. His face was nothing less than a map upon which the blood-drenched history of Thebes was carved. The scars of the agonizing death struggle to liberate his native Cadmea from ruthless Spartan dominion, alongside the bruises of that fierce victory at Leuctra, were etched into his countenance as profound and proud brandings. While his ally Epaminondas invaded the southern Peloponnese, gouging out the heart of Sparta, liberating the enslaved Messenians to construct an independent state, and permanently stripping Sparta of its foundation for survival, Pelopidas, the other Titan, had advanced northward at the head of his forces. Having swiftly suppressed the turmoil of the Thessalian region and completely absorbed its influence, the iron hoplites of Thebes had finally reached the border of that uncultivated northern colossus, the kingdom of Macedon. This was the exact cadence of the arrival of the blazing sun, the moment dreaded by the usurper Ptolemy, and toward which the Queen Mother Eurydice cast her gaze, thirsting for a covenant of blood. Pelopidas was the very heart of passion itself, forming a flawless counterweight to the cold intellect of his ally Epaminondas. Together, they had once smashed the physical myth of Spartan invincibility into fragments and dust, elevating Thebes to the apex of Greek hegemony. Yet, in the stifling Thessalian night, the weight called hegemony pressed down upon his shoulders with singular heaviness. Why was he now advancing his troops into this sweltering north? It was no mere territorial expansion. Now that they had driven southern Sparta to the precipice of ruin, if Thebes were to reign as the immovable master hegemon of all Greece, it was absolutely necessary to place the north at their back, namely, the fertile cavalry breeding grounds of Thessaly and the inexhaustible resource zone of Macedonia, completely under control, which is to say, inside the cage of their own intellect. True, hegemony could never be consummated without pacifying the north. This was the cold geostrategic ambition that drove Pelopidas forward. The faint rustle of the pavilion's tapestry echoed through the space, and Charon, a veteran Boeotian general, entered. Illumined by the lamplight, his expression was exceedingly austere. General Pelopidas. Regarding the sudden crisis in Macedon, a high-priority missive has arrived from Lord Epaminondas in Thebes, routed through Athens. Pelopidas broke the wax seal in silence. Pressed into it was the coat of arms of Macedon, a lion in agony. He swept his eyes swiftly over the fluid script, furrowing his thick brows fiercely. From Macedon, you say? Who, precisely, is the author of this document? Both factions, General, Charon replied. Beneath the calm tone characteristic of a warrior in his 40s, there seeped a deep suspicion toward the fathomless intrigues of the northern court. We have an envoy from Ptolemy of Elorus who continues to sign with the title of regent and completely separate from him. A courier of distress from the faction of Queen Mother Eurydice, who secretly implores our army's intervention from within the palace. Both sides are performing a hideous private feud, begging for the sword of Thebes. The corner of Pelopidas's lips twisted into a thin distortion. With the ashes of the king's funeral pyre scarcely cold, the raw shock of regicide still hung thick in the air. Less than a month had passed since King Alexander II had been stabbed from behind and slaughtered. A serpent by the name of Ptolemy had already seized the reins, crawling about as nominal regent for the young princes Perdiccas III and Philip. Pelopidas vividly recalled the memory of his own intervention in Macedonia a year ago. Ptolemy, Pelopidas scoffed, letting loose a cold, dry, and bitter friction of a laugh. Still clinging to power like a barnacle to a reef, he begs us for arbitration. In other words, by displaying the overwhelming martial might of my sacred band, he wishes to invest his blood-stained usurpation with a false legitimacy sanctioned by Thebes. A despicable man. And yet, General, the state of anarchy in that land threatens to needlessly drain our military strength, Charon added, offering his geostrategic concern. His tone carried a strong wariness and distrust, as if fearing that by meddling in an uncultivated land, Thebes might find itself ensnared in a quagmire of conflict. A vulnerable Macedonia invites Illyrian incursions, leaving a vacuum that threatens our rear. Conversely, a consolidated and powerful Macedonia under a flawed ruler, like Ptolemy, could easily become a grave thorn in the flank of Boeotia in the future. Pelopidas rose to his feet, pacing restlessly within the narrow confines of the pavilion. The map of Thessaly was already completely cleansed from his mind. His spirit was scanning the jagged, austere mountains of the Argead kingdom. Within Epaminondas's missive, an astonishing stratagem had been inscribed. Queen Mother Eurydice had approached the Athenian general Iphicrates, who had immediately forwarded the reality to Thebes. Iphicrates' counsel was exceedingly precise. The sole path to rescue the youngest prince, Philip, and simultaneously chain Macedonia within the Theban cage of order, is none other than to immure that 14-year-old boy within the Cadmea as the highest hostage of royal blood. Epaminondas, you two visualize the exact same blueprint so beautifully. Pelopidas concurred deeply within his breast. They summon us because they stand in the very midst of a desperate broken ruin. Within Pelopidas's eyes, the lethal, hazardous sparks peculiar to a man who leads a hegemonic state flickered. Therein dwelt an absolute expectation to ruthlessly exploit the tragedy of another nation. They have confirmed with their own blood that Thebes is the absolute judge and master hegemon of all Greece. This is nothing less than the perfect opportunity to definitively engineer the future structure of that kingdom in a manner that serves our Boeotian state interests. We shall feign recognition of Ptolemy's usurpation, while in truth we hold the windpipe of the Argead royal house entirely within our palm. He tucked the parchment into his belt. Marshal the departure of the squadron. We ride for Macedonia at dawn. Charon, those people seek a physician to pacify their acute crisis. When our army descends upon that land as a surgeon, I expect them to correctly comprehend the meaning of that absolute and severe price. As the sound of Charon's military boots receded into the distance, Pelopidas reached for a fresh scroll of parchment. Thebes did not wield its martial might out of mere charitable sentiment. Every military intervention demanded a colossal return to balance the ledger. What currency could Macedonia present? It was none other than the inexhaustible timber required to construct the warships of our sacred band to counter Athens, and the pure white silver to fill the treasuries of Thebes. They would thoroughly drain the flesh called raw materials from Macedonia. Yet, the true objective that captivated him most lay far beyond economic profit, the presence of a single hostage. To completely guarantee Macedonian loyalty for generations to come, Thebes would plunder the very future of that kingdom. He could vividly visualize the young Prince Philip being marched into the fortress of the Cadmea. In that land, beneath the massive shadow cast by the sacred band and under the severe philosophy and tutelage of Epaminondas himself, the boy would be flawlessly transfigured. He would witness the absolute discipline, radiated by 300 male lovers, and absorb the supreme aesthetic of the oblique phalanx into his very blood and bone. That 14-year-old boy, what sort of eyes does he possess? Is he of a caliber to become a docile decorative bird inside my cage, or? Pelopidas dipped his quill deep into the black ink. The colossal geostrategic gamble named Macedonia was at this very cadence unfolding. He was about to invite a young lion cub into the eagle's nest, entirely unaware of the fact that he was constructing with his own hands that immortal monster. Philip, too, who would one day break the entire world Pelopidas had built, and the very hegemony of Thebes itself, into fragments and dust. To be continued. A Great Argead Saga Alexein. Volume 1, Telesias, the War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Subscribe to follow the rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.